Canon have finally announced the R3, and I've decided I'm renaming it the Black Knight, after Monty Python's The Holy Grail. Because for years, the 1D towered over the rest of the market, saying,
"None shall pass."
And then along came Sony with the A9, and Canon went,
"'Tis but a scratch."
And then Sony released the A9 too, and Canon went,
"Just a flesh wound."
And then the A1 dealt the killer blow,
Right!
and Canon went,
Right, I'll do you for that.
Now Canon released the R3, which carries the resolution of an A9, but with the price tag of an A1, and then says,
All right, we'll call it a draw.
Sorry, I'm just kidding. You know what it's like when you think of something and you know you don't really believe it, and part of you thinks it's probably best not to say it, then the other part you thinks it's too funny and ends up winning. Anyway, before anyone asks, no, I don't have the R3. I haven't even tried the camera out. I mean, come on, look at me. I'm not even a blip on Canon's radar. I'm a nobody in the grand scheme of things. Not only that, I'm a nobody who shoots Sony. I'd be lucky if I get a high five from Canon, much less an R3. But I'm not actually going to delve too much into the specs of the R3 itself. Even though it looks a very impressive piece of kit, it's obviously something that I'm not going to buy. 1, it's the wrong system. 2, even if it wasn't, it's total overkill for what I need. And 3, I couldn't afford it even if I wanted it. Hence why I don't have an A9 or an A1, because I instead have an A-Child Mark III. But even if these flagship cameras aren't something that you're ever likely to own, they are still going to affect you in the years to come, because the technology will naturally trickle down into future generations of lower tier models. For example, Canon's first full-frame DSLR was the 1DS. It was 11 megapixels and could shoot 3 frames a second, and it cost $8,000. Only 3 years later, the 5D Mark II came out, which could shoot a whole 1 frame a second faster at nearly double the resolution, for less than half the price. Nowadays, if a company tried releasing a full-frame camera with a 21 megapixel sensor that could only shoot 4 frames a second and only manage 1080p video with no autofocus, most people probably wouldn't want to pay 200 quid for that. But how much the technology is able to trickle down is kind of determined by how much the top tiers are moving up. If the top tiers remain pretty static, then there's no headroom for the lower tiers to improve either. And I think that's kind of what happened with Canon's DSLRs for quite a while. Really until the mirrorless revolution and competition from Sony re-energized the market. Because if you think back, the 5D Mark II to the 5D III went from 4 frames a second up to 6, and from 21 up to 22 megapixels. The main changes really were the autofocus and going to 2 card slots. Then the 5D4 went up to 30 megapixels and a whole 1 more frame a second to 7, but everything else was basically the same, apart from including dual pixel autofocus. So that's really 9 megapixels and 3 frames a second increase in 11 years between the Mark II to the Mark IV. But then with the move to mirrorless and competition pushing more performance, the R5 came along as really the spiritual successor to the 5D4, and in that single generation move, they added another 15 megapixels and 13 frames a second to the specs. And now we've kind of seen the same from the 1D line. From the 1DX in 2012 to the 1DX3 in 2020, those models went up 2 megapixels from 18 to 20, and up 4 frames a second from 12 to 16 for shooting speeds through the viewfinder with full autofocus. And yet the R3 has managed to double that resolution increase, up another 4 megapixels, and nearly doubled the viewfinder shooting speed up to 30 frames a second. Canon have basically made more gains in performance in one generation than they had done in the past 3 generations combined. Which is obviously fantastic news for the market and really what we've all been waiting for. because this jump has definitely been driven by the gains made from Sony over the past few years. But it's good that Canon have stepped up to challenge them, because it's not only driven Canon forward, but also will ensure that Sony don't start resting on their laurels and instead will keep them pushing forward as well. I think what's very interesting though is how the R3 compares up to Sony's cameras, because it kind of sits in the middle of the A9 II and the A1. I've speculated in the past that I think Canon were probably gearing the R3 to be a flagship that would beat the A9 II, but that kind of got sideswiped by the unexpected release of the A1. Now sure, the R3 is launching at a price $1,500 higher than the launch price of the A9 II, despite the fact that it has the same resolution. But it shoots 50% faster, and it can shoot 14-bit at 30 frames a second, whereas the A9 II can only manage 12 frames a second at 14-bit. At 20 frames a second, you're only getting 12-bit. The R3 also has a built-in grip, which is an extra cost if you want it on the A9. Some people will, some people won't. The R3 can also manage 6K RAW video and 4K 120, and it has eye control autofocus. So really, in terms of price to performance, it's kind of in line, possibly even ahead of what the A9 II is offering. Obviously, for a similar price, you can have the A1, which can also manage 30 frames a second, although again, that's only in 12-bit. But the major advantage for the A1 is that it has double the resolution of the R3. And I think it's great that the competition have basically staggered their cameras against each other. Because if Canon had just come out with, say, an exact copy of the A9 II at exactly the same price point, then Canon and Sony could have basically just gone,
All right, we call it a draw.
and then we could have ended up with both of them just stagnating and gradually matching each other with incremental increases for years to come. Instead, this could spur Sony to look at faster shooting at 14-bit for, say, the A9 III and the A1 Mark II, as well as maybe adding some form of eye control autofocus as well, whilst Canon could be working on an R1 with a higher resolution to try and rival the A1. Although, if the R3 is $6,000, an R1 could be pushing $8,000. But more importantly, these gains for the top cameras moving forward is going to leave lots of headroom for the lower cameras to move up in terms of specs as well. And maybe even start to see some of this new technology like eye control autofocus and stack sensors dropping into future R5 and A7 models. Even if they were to, say, bring out stack sensors but without the really high shooting speeds, that will still greatly improve rolling shutter performance. So it definitely looks like an exciting few years ahead for the camera market. But what do you make of the R3? Leave your thoughts and comments in the box down below. While you're down there, please consider supporting this channel by clicking the like and subscribe buttons if you haven't already done so, and then hopefully we'll see you in the next video.